All right. Okay. So welcome to our final webinar for 2021. So kia ora, nisambula vinaka, namaste, assalamu alaikum, malolele, talofa, noya, and warm Pacific greetings. Welcome to our December webinar. Before I introduce the speaker for today, just a few housekeeping rules. As always, in true Pacific style, it's very informal, and we welcome talanoa at the end of the presentation. And there's two ways that you can do that. You can either type in your questions or comments in the chat box, or you can ask them yourselves. I prefer that you ask yourself. At least we get to hear your voice and hear the comments that you're making. We also have a Facebook page, a Twitter page, a YouTube account, and a web page. I've posted the details of these in our chat box, so do check them out. And if you're not a member of the Facebook group, please do join. You can view our latest information, news, recorded webinars on that group. Finally, I also request you to keep your mic on mute during the presentation. And also, if you want a certificate of attendance from attending this webinar, please drop your email in the chat box and I will send these out to you. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Pranit Anand. Dr. Pranit Anand is a lecturer of learning design at Queensland University of Technology since 2019. Prior to this, he was a lecturer in computing studies at the University of Wollongong, Sunway University, Malaysia, and at the Fiji Institute of Technology. He holds a PhD in education, focusing on effective use of mobile technologies to develop students' motivation and learn and their self-regulation skills. So over the years, Pranit has explored meaningful uses of educational technologies in different settings, but significantly ways to use technology to engage diverse cohorts of students, particularly those from marginalized and disadvantaged backgrounds. He recognizes the power of assessment in higher education to engage students in the learning process, but also how many forms of assessment play such a demotivating role in students' lives. Towards this, Pranit continues to investigate alternative forms of assessment, such as digital storytelling, open internet examinations, and collaborative social projects, amongst other projects. So during his presentation, Pranit will share some of these alternative forms of authentic online assessments that may help us move away from many of the traditional forms of assessment. Sorry about that. Welcome, Pranit, and I look forward to your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all that, Jalal. Sometimes I realize, how difficult it is when you give your bio and it becomes a challenge to go through all of that. But thank you for that introduction. Look, it's really a pleasure to be presenting and be talking to you all about my pet subject, which is basically assessments, but particularly assessments for students from various different disadvantaged backgrounds. And I'll talk about some of those things very, very shortly. So the topic of today is on online authentic assessments. As Jalal mentioned, my name is Pranit Anand. I'm a lecturer in learning design at Queensland University of Technology. I'm fairly prolific on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is at Pranit_A, and I'd encourage you to engage with that now and continue to do that. I've got a little image on the right hand side of my screen over here. It says believing in yourself is the secret to success, and I think that defines many students who come into university, come into higher education, particularly students from various different marginalized and disadvantaged communities. And I'll talk about some of those things very, very shortly. Before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where Queensland University of Technology stands. As you know, I work for QUT, and QUT acknowledges the Turrbal and the Yagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay respect to elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. I also recognize that although we are joining from different parts of the world, it looks like most of you are from Fiji, so one person from New Zealand, and I'm joining from Australia. We are still on some traditional lands, and I therefore acknowledge all Indigenous peoples and their connection to the land and the important role they continue to play in education and research. I also like to give a big shout out, big Nisambula to my clan back in Fiji Islands. I come from Mari Reki in the Fiji Islands. Some of you may be familiar with that part of Fiji. It's a tiny little place, sort of northern tip of the main island of Fiji. I was the first in my family to finish high school. Nobody else that I know of in my family had finished high school. Basically, what that meant was I had no clue what I was doing. I didn't know what to study. I didn't know how to study. I didn't know universities even existed, for example. I can't, sometimes I pinch myself that I ended up getting a PhD. Throughout my school days, I was not good at school, and my schoolmates would probably be surprised to know that I'm a doctor these days, for example, because I never was very good at school. There were a lot of people who were much better than me. And as you know, in Fiji at that time, and it probably is to a certain extent these days as well, you had a grading system. You have to come first, second, third, for example. I was around number 20 all the time, so that was my place in my school. I came to realize much later on that I don't think it was me necessarily, but it seemed like there was something wrong with the system that I just did not engage with. I'll come back to my background and how that has influenced my approaches to teaching and learning a little bit later on. But I just want to get into the topic for today, and that is about assessments a little bit. We use assessments in education as part of our education ecosystem all the time. It's probably the cornerstone of our education system. I am yet to come across a course, for example, respectable course that does not have any form of assessment. I'm not saying that there should not be, there should in fact be, but most courses have assessments as part of the cornerstone. We have assessment intended consequences, and these are to motivate students to engage in the learning activities. You think about it, you tell your students to go and study about something. How often do they actually study until you tell them that this is coming in an assessment, whether it's an exam or a report or an essay or whatever it might be. So assessments have a very powerful motivating factor. We also develop awareness about current and expected abilities, both for students and teachers. For teachers, for example, we make judgments about students' ability or their readiness to progress, for example. If you're in primary school, should the student move from year 5 to year 6, for example? Should the student at university move from year 1 to year 2? Should the student even graduate? In the case of students, for example, they use assessments to judge their own capabilities as well. Assessments also have, unintended consequences as well. And the unintended consequences are actually quite often very, very dangerous, because as educators, quite often we do not consider the unintended consequences. And these are anxiety, stress. I remember going to an exam and I'd almost be shaking with fear, for example. And I know so many of my students, when they are subjected to go for examinations, for example, the amount of anxiety that they have to deal with is just enormous. Students often get disengaged as a direct result of assessments. Many of them drop out of studies because the assessments were so hard. Some of the studies that we have done when I was at University of Wollongong, for example, Students often comment, I don't mind going to university, for example, but the assessments are just really, really hard. I couldn't deal with that. So what do we do assessments for? Why do we use assessments? Assessments, generally speaking, if you are using assessments, I'm trying to move my picture out of the way, you should be encouraged the use of more formative assessments that develop skills and aptitude for higher education studies. Less but better quality summative studies. So if you could avoid having an exam at the end of the semester or end of term exam, great. Induct students into the assessment approach used. Students often are not familiar with an assessment approach that we are using. So it's important that as educators, we induct them into the process. It must always be designed for learning, not designed to test of learning. So we must always encourage design assessments where as the students engage in the assessment, they engage in learning as well. And always ask, why are we assessing? Why are we actually assessing? Do we really need to? And we must continue to develop an assessment or a learning mindset so that students are engaging in learning continuously. So developing an ongoing mindset about continuous learning. So why assess, why authentic, and why online? Before I talk a little bit about that, I want you to just pay a little bit of attention on the little picture that I've got on the right-hand side of the screen. Quite often we have exactly the same type of assessment and we give the same assessment to all students, regardless of the background, regardless of anything else that we consider in our education system. And we think that's fair. That's the only way to do it. When you think about it, it could be the most unfair system that we have used. And case in point is examinations over here. As you'll come across this presentation today, I've got an enormous dislike of examinations, but we tend to use it all the time, and quite often we enforce the same way of doing things on all our students without realizing the different backgrounds that they come from, different preferences that they have. So why do we assess? It should never be just because we've always done it that way. You must always assess to help students learn. That's the most important thing. And always make it relevant. Students do not like doing, anybody for that matter, put yourself in their shoes. They don't like to do something that's not relevant to them. Engage all learners. How many times have students studied just because you have asked them to? So diversify the way in which students engage in your assessment, but more importantly, the way in which they demonstrate their learning. Recognize the diverse ways students engage, and then they should also have their own ways of demonstrating that learning. It must reflect contemporary strengths, skills, and attitudes. How often do we pay attention to developing attitudes for now and for the future? In fact, I'd say not many assessments in higher education, but also other education systems pay attention to attitudes. Make technology inherently part of the experience. Don't try and translate an offline assessment into an online environment. It's just not going to work. You will encounter problems. You will encounter all kinds of problems for yourself as an educator, but more significantly for your students. David Bowd, some of you might be familiar with David Bowd. David Bowd is the director of the Cradle Institute at Deakin University, and he's a prominent author when it comes to assessments. And he wrote, "Students can sometimes escape bad teaching, but they cannot escape bad assessments." And if you look at the attendance of lectures, for example, these days, and I want you to reflect, if you hold your own lectures, how many students attend your lectures if it's not compulsory? In my institution, for example, if I go and observe many other classes, the attendance levels is very, very low because the students are actually choosing and demonstrating what they like and they don't like. So coming to online assessments, and I'd like to share 3 examples that I have used. But before I talk about that, I think it's very, very important that as educators, we get into this mindset that we do not have to put up with something that have always existed. If you believe it's not the right way of doing it, be brave to go on and try different things. So I'll share 3 different assessments that I have used in different settings. In my own settings, I've taught computer science at University of Wollongong, and when I was in Malaysia and when I was in Fiji as well. These days, I don't teach computer science. I do different things, but I help other academics. So I've used it in computer science. We've used it in robotics. We've used it in humanities as well. So I'll share 3 assessment types. These are digital storybooks, investigative case studies, and open internet examinations. First one is digital storytelling or digital storybook, for example. Storytelling, as you know, is inherently part of the human experience. Most human beings, regardless of the culture, like to tell stories. Uh, what we are trying to do here is help them capture these stories using technology. And these stories, because they're individual stories, they are individually relevant, and therefore your assessment becomes individually relevant. Every person has their own story. So for example, students can create a storybook using any technology tools that they want about that they're familiar with. One of the things that I've done in my setting, for example, is in computer science, I've created a digital storybook about how information technology is used in the area of studies, in area of work that the students want to get into. So they put together a very short story, digital story. They could use PowerPoint. Many of them use some kind of video type of thing, but they showcase all the technologies that they've been engaging with, but more importantly, how these technologies will be used in the future and what other technologies can be used. So students reflect on an experiment and therefore develop high order thinking. Some of you as educators might be using reflection in your settings. So for example, we ask students to engage in an experiment, in an exercise, read a book, read a journal article, etc., etc. And then we ask them to write a reflection. You could turn that written reflection into a reflective storybook, digital storybook. By doing that, it becomes a lot more engaging for the students. If you look at cognitive load theory and cognitive science, for example, there's enough evidence to say that the videos are a lot more engaging. And when you think about it, it's a contemporary way of communicating. So students engage in this and put together a reflective piece. It doesn't matter what they use, as long as it's engaging, it allows students to tell their own story. Because they're telling their own story, when I interviewed academics, markers, including students about it, we never encountered any incidences of plagiarism whatsoever, because every single story is a personalized story. The other thing that I've used is investigative case studies. These are basically collaborative social projects. You could call it whatever you want to call it, but it's basically students working with NGOs to help solve real life problems. So these are, for example, real life activities that students engage in, often in small groups. Group work must be complex enough to warrant a group work. When I talk to many educators, many of them say, oh, look, group work is really hard. Some students do the work, many students don't do the work. You always end up with 1 or 2 students carrying the whole group through. Yes, if it can be done by 1 student, it will be done by 1 student, and the other people will let that 1 student do the work. So if you put group work together, make it hard. It has to be hard. It must be complex, and it should only be done in a group. Otherwise, it's not group work. So designing group work so that technology becomes relevant and students choose appropriate tools. I'll give you an example. In my setting, again, in computer science, students work in small groups to contact a not-for-profit organization located in a developing country. So not in Australia. They can't work for an NGO in Australia. And develop and implement a social media strategy for them. A very simple exercise when you think about it. If you worked in that space, IT, It's not that complex, but the complex is the process. They have to contact an NGO who is located in a different country. They have to form a group and identify, communicate in real time to this NGO and identify the problems and develop and implement a solution for them. Can you see the technology is inherently part embedded in the assessment itself? What I also do is, in some semesters, my students work with groups of students from other universities as well. Again, the process becomes even more complex. So I've got friends at universities in Hong Kong, for example, and I often get two of my students in Australia to work with two or three students from Hong Kong, and they are formed in one group, and they have to collaborate, negotiate all the different settings that exist between the two geographical locations, and then solve a problem. Therefore, online is inherently built into the assessment itself, and this particular assessment can only be done online. There's no offline component to it, right? So it's embedded. Online is embedded. Just before I move on to the other assessment that I want to talk about, I just want to quickly talk a little bit about group work, because that's so important. When you talk to educators and students, nobody likes group work. Nobody likes group work. The only reason why many educators use group work because it reduces the marking load. That's the wrong way to do it, right? Group work always increases the workload on the educators. It does inherently, and it should. Many educators and students feel overwhelmed about group work. And if you've got, if you're lucky enough to have students who are non-English speakers, many people complain about that, particularly students who are native English speakers complain about having to work with students whose English is not their first language. But if done correctly, it becomes an enjoyable experience. In my classes, for example, when you have the end of semester feedback that the university sends out, for example, most students always comment that one of the things that they most enjoyed about this particular subject working with me was the group work, because you design it properly. So how do you do it? You introduce the group work gradually. Students don't know how to work with other people. It doesn't come naturally to them. You think about it, primary school, all that they've taught to do was compete. You have to compete. You think about it, you have to come first. If you collaborate with somebody else, you might not be coming first. Go to high school, again, it's the competitive nature. Collaboration is generally forced out of many students. We have to bring that back in. And then you provide appropriate scaffolds along the way as well. So what I do small group-based activities. In Australia, we get many international students. I don't care if they speak in their own language. Week 1 and 2, they choose who you want to work with, for example. And these are very simple things. Most students work with students who speak the same language. Great, they're building confidence. Once they build confidence, I move them out of their comfort zone, and then I put them into majors, whichever major they want to get into. And then we use international examples where students are familiar with, and then we develop individual research and application problems before they undertake this big group project in the end. The other type of assessment that I have used is known as the open internet examinations, and I'm very, very proud of that. Is because I started using this open internet examinations about 7-8 years ago, way before anybody would have even thought about COVID and the force to move online and online examinations. If you have to do exams, think about other ways of doing it. Putting students, you see that picture on the top left-hand side of the picture group there, for example, subjecting students to do an exam in that way is, in my opinion, torture. Literally, it is torture. And so if you have to do exam, think differently. In my case, these are written exams. In fact, they're typed exams. They don't use pen and paper. Examinations are conducted in computer labs, but the students are allowed to bring in any device they wish including internet-enabled mobile phones and tablets. And students are not only allowed to, but they're encouraged to use Google and any other internet services. I know some of you might be freaking out over here, but I'll explain that in a little while. So I've got 4 pictures on the right-hand side of my screen over there. As I've already mentioned, one of them, you see groups of students doing exams. And as I said, if you can't subject students to perform at the optimum in those conditions, nobody can. I never did. That's why I wasn't very good at high school, as I mentioned earlier on. The other thing is that there are certain generations of people who really genuinely work really well and think really well if their fingers are touching the keyboard. I'm not one of those. If I need to read a journal article, even if I'm reading it online, I must hold a pen in my hand. If my fingers are not touching the pen, my brain does not engage, right? But that's me. Remember, I'm a very old person. I don't know, Jalal might be able to add a little bit afterwards. I'm sure there's a bit of scientific evidence from neuroscience that would probably allow us to say there's some kind of neurological connection between the physical objects that we touch as well as what we're reading and responding to. But also, when you think about authentic workplaces, that picture on the bottom left-hand side of the group there, most workplaces look like that. Well, not as neat as that, but certainly there's 2 or 3 screens, there's multiple devices sitting on your screen, etc., etc. So if we want to give students an authentic experience for the real world, why don't we set up an exam that looks like an authentic setting as well? Now, if you're going to use online open internet exam, what do? The questions need to change. If you're going to just simply ask students the same kind of questions, it's not going to work. You've got to change the questions. So the questions should not depend on students to memorize the content. In fact, it should never be memorizing. If you are writing any kind of exam questions where the students can memorize and regurgitate, you're not testing anything. I think you're wasting everybody's time. Enable students to use the internet to solve the problems. So it always has to be problem solving. Allow students to apply concepts learned in class. If the students don't know the concepts already, they can search it up, but they're wasting valuable time. So for example, again, in my computer science classes, traditionally, I would ask things like, what is a CPU? Some of you might be using it. Maybe it's an old type of question. Explain the function of different parts of the CPU, for example. What does it really matter if somebody knows what a CPU is or different parts of the CPU? I think that's irrelevant. In an online exam, you have been asked, I would ask something like this. You have been asked to suggest the configurations of 3 computers for your home network that will be required to run MS Word, MS Excel, and Prezi. Now, remember, this question is a little bit old over here. That's why we've got Prezi, but you got PowerPoint 4.0, whatever. Identify the CPU requirements for each of these software and recommend the CPU configurations and price of 3 computers. Now that becomes more authentic again. Students can only solve this problem if they have access to the internet, for example. And don't you think it's nice to actually get students to engage in these types of activities and then provide a solution? Now, getting to the end of my presentation. So once again, assessments, make them relevant, please. You will disengage students if it's not relevant. Explore non-traditional options. Some of the examples that I've given you, for example, may not apply in your setting, but if you can move away from traditional assessments as we move to a more online assessment regime, please do so. Allow flexibility, style, structure, format, topics. I have a very, as I mentioned earlier on, I work with many equity groups, for example, students particularly from many disadvantaged backgrounds, many students who have lives outside of the university setting. For example, they have families, they've got kids, they've got brothers to look after, they've got uncles, moms, dads, etc. to look after as well. A due date will not change your life. Never. In fact, when you think about it, many educators, put a deadline on a Friday afternoon. Your assignment will be due at 5:30 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Do you think that that educator will mark it on Saturday and Sunday? Most probably not. Why don't you put it on a Monday morning? Give the students another couple of days. Why not? It's not going to change your life, but it could certainly change the student's life. Show empathy through the assessment design. So build flexibility in the assessment design. If a student is not willing or not comfortable writing an essay, can they create a video? If the student is not comfortable doing a video for that assignment, can they write an essay? Right, so allow that flexibility in your assessment. Now, coming back to my background, for example, and I've got some pictures of here that has defined the way I think, and particularly the three assessment types that I have talked about. Many of you might be familiar with the top left-hand picture, the kava bowl in Fiji, for example. The times that I can tell you that I was sitting around with my mom, my dad, my uncles, for example, sitting bored as a little kid, for example, when the adults would talk about nonsense, for example, I'd be sitting in a corner feeling bored. But those things were one of the most valuable learning lessons for me because that embedded storytelling in me. I like telling stories and I continue to tell stories. I know many students, for example, like telling stories, particularly students from various different disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, they like to tell their own story. Stories personalizes their learning experiences. As I mentioned early on, I grew up in the beautiful village of Waimari in the northern tip of VT Levu, for example. And that's a typical picture of most villages growing up there as well. And therefore, I know the importance of helping others, for example, community building, the importance of supporting each other. For example, when I was growing up, and I think many people in my age group, for example, we didn't have a library in our school and things like that. So we depended on the goodwill of other people to provide books and things like that. And I encourage that type of thinking in my students as well through the types of assessments I get them to do. And the other thing that I've mentioned already, I did not like exams. And this is a typical exam room, for example, for many students. And this picture is from the Fiji Times. So it's likely to be a classroom in Fiji, for example. But every single country has a similar sort of setting. The level of anxiety that exists when students go in and do an exam in that kind of hot and humid environment is just torture, I think. And therefore, in my way, and that has influenced the way in which I design my learning approaches and the types of assessments I create. As I mentioned early on, my Twitter handle is @Pranit_A. My email address is pranit.anand@qt.edu.au. One of the things that I like to leave you with is keep learning about assessment to enable better quality assessments. Focus on student success long term. And on that note, I'll stop my share, and I think we have time for questions, isn't it, Jalal?